put together this program for you. We're looking forward to a lot of interesting talks and discussions during the day. The program is roughly laid out into three parts. In the first part, we're looking at advances and challenges in VQA. We're starting off with Professor Lana Lazabnik, who's going to be telling us a bit about specialized knowledge for vision and language tasks. Marcus Rohrbach from FAIR, who's going to be talking about end-to-end module networks. Professor Kate Sanka, who's going to be telling us about explaining and diversifying captioning models. Professor Derek Hoem, who's going to be telling, and in particular, both Derek and Anton's talk are about challenges and dangers in VQA, about what we may be missing and what we may want to think about next. The second part of the day of the program is about the 2017 VQA challenge. So we have a quick 10-minute presentation about the Eval AI platform that we used this year. We built it out of the Cloud CV project. It was out of my lab that we used to host the challenge. And then, of course, an overview of what did we find in the challenge, analysis of the results, announcement of the winners, and talks by the winning teams. All the winning teams and the runners-up, we're awarding NVIDIA GPUs, so please stick around for that. After lunch, in particular, we are looking to look towards the future. So where is this headed? I think there's a theme emerging where a lot of speakers are talking about interaction, a back and forth interaction with humans. Sanya is going to be talking about teaching machines to describe images with human feedback. Jason has a background in natural language processing and machine learning. He's going to be talking about unifying QA, dialogue, VQA, and visual dialogue. Abhishek Das is going to be talking about visual dialogue, and Hugo La Rochelle is going to be talking about a guess what game, which is fairly an interesting setup. At the end of the day, we have a panel session with all the invited speakers. I recommend you to stick around for that, ask any questions. We're in particular looking at what's missing, where we're going next, and then we'll just close for the day. One quick logistical note. To the poster presenters, all of the workshops, so posters for all of the workshops are in the same location. They're downstairs where the main conference posters were. Areas will be marked by the conference organizers during the morning break, but please put up your poster at the soonest whenever the area is already marked, hopefully by the morning break or the lunchtime. So. Last year, we had given out these VQA T-shirts to all of the invited speakers, and I see Marcus showing dedication wearing that T-shirt. So all of the poster presenters, invited speakers, please pick up. We'll hand you your T-shirt, but please if we don't pick it up during the poster presentation. Continuing the self-deprecating status, so from 1.0 to 2.0, the T-shirt this year has 2 images, not 1, with opposite answers. And so we have these T-shirts for you, so please pick them up. All right, so with that, that's the plan for the day. I'll hand it over to Aishwarya, who's introducing Lana.
Thanks, Dudu. Our next speaker is, the first speaker of our workshop is Lana Lazabnik. Lana is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at UIUC. Lana has done some very influential work in visual recognition and scene understanding. Most relevant to this workshop is her work on joint modeling of images and text. Lana's work on learning joint embeddings of images and text and more recent work on grounded language understanding have been of great importance to vision and language community. Today, Lana is going to talk to us about transfer of specialized knowledge for vision language tasks. We are looking forward to hear from you, Lana.
Thank you. So this is 20 minutes plus 5 minutes questions. Okay, so can you give me like a 5-minute warning or something? Okay, so thank you very much for giving me the honor of going first. So I have not worked too much on sort of full-scale open-ended VQA. But hopefully I will talk about what I see as one of the biggest challenges facing current methods. So what do I mean by specialized knowledge exactly? I don't mean anything too esoteric. I just mean in order to be able to answer any kind of free-form question, what kind of knowledge does a VQA system need to have? So let's give some specific examples. I went through the VQA 1.0 images and questions and try to categorize some of the more common types of specialized knowledge. So in particular, systems need to have knowledge of common object categories, scenes, maybe fine-grained categories, materials, and so on. So almost everybody who works on VQA, their first shot is just kind of train or take an ImageNet trained network, do something on top of that. So we can assume that ImageNet trained networks already have some good deal of knowledge about object categories, but we need more. We need textures, we need scenes, and so on, nouns, if you will. Then, of course, we need a lot of verbs. We need to understand actions and activities. We need to understand what people, animals, and so on, objects are capable of doing, what they might be doing next, and so on and so forth. We need, of course, adjectives. We need all sorts of attributes. So in particular, people are among the most interesting entities that we care about. So we need to have a very good catalog of attributes describing appearance of people, clothing of people, accessories, and so on. Then, kind of stretching our imagination a little bit more, we need to be able to describe motivations. Why are people doing what they're doing? Or, causality. Why is something happening? Something happened before, therefore something is happening now. Maybe somebody fell down, that's why they're sitting in the snow. Even farther afield, there are some questions that have to do with recognizing syntax. So that tends to be a pretty specialized task these days. You really need to build a custom system if you want to be able to read text that's embedded within scenes, or recognize logos, recognize street signs, and so on. What else might we need? There is currently probably small but very interesting category of questions that really can't be answered given the image alone, and can't be answered using purely visual knowledge. You need knowledge of something beyond, common sense facts, maybe knowledge that you scrape from Wikipedia, knowledge databases that are in text form, and so on. So this is what I mean by specialized knowledge. Of course, if we just take a generic network, roughly speaking, trained on ImageNet, fine-tuned in some form on the VQA data set, I think we can all agree there's no hope that that network can really capture all of the aspects of real-world knowledge that open-ended VQA entails. So what can we do? I don't really know, but at present, I know that we have a lot of special purpose data sets that have much better coverage for some forms of specialized knowledge that's very useful for VQA. So things like actions and activities, attributes, materials, and so on. So I will talk a little bit about our work. Attempting in some limited way to use these special purpose networks trained on data sets external to VQA, but that are very useful to VQA. So we haven't worked on the VQA data set. We've worked on the Visual MATLABs data set collected by my collaborators, Alex and Tamara Berg. This is kind of like VQA, but with lots of training wheels. These are fill-in-the-blank questions with only 4 options each, so it's multiple choice. They come sometimes with side information, very useful information like bounding boxes, as I'll show in a moment, and they have predefined semantic types. There are 12 types of questions. Each question has very well-defined semantics that you can use to figure out what knowledge do you need to answer this type of question. So here are some details. This is what one type of MATLAB's question looks like. It's a scene question, and the prompt is always the same. The place is, and you have 4 options. You have to pick one. So what can we do? Well, we can train a network using the MIT scenes dataset. And MIT scenes dataset has several hundred scene categories. So you can think of that network as outputting a vector of predictions for specific scene classes. And we just have to somehow relate these vectors of predictors according to the fixed vocabulary of that dataset to the free-form vocabulary of answer choices. And there are relatively straightforward tools for doing that, like CCA. So we can just see, just examine the top predictions from the scene network. Scene network thinks it's a train station platform, so it should be very easy to match that to train station as the best choice. There are other questions that are more tricky, like past and future questions. So this is a future question. You're supposed to choose what's most likely to happen next. And because of the way that these alternative answers are selected, the different answers have different subjects. So you have to try to match each subject for each candidate answer and figure out, does it fit the image? Does it look like the image has a bride in it, or a man, or a woman? And that helps you to choose the right answer. And of course, we may also want to detect objects, because some of these answers mention objects. So we want to examine the image, figure out, do these mentioned objects fit the image, and so on. There are other questions that include ground truth regions, and these were also given to the people who provided the annotations that the questions are created from. So if you want to ask, what is this person doing, you need to specify which person, because there might be multiple people in the image. So even to a human, it's going to be ambiguous. But of course, this is a very big crutch, if you will, because we don't need to automatically detect people here. We can just make predictions from an action network and also do some sort of matching from the predefined action classes that we were trained on to the free-form answers. And then there might be other questions about object attributes. We can predict colors. We can train a classifier for colors, maybe other adjectives, and so on and so forth. So this is the flavor of what the Visual MATLAB's dataset is and what we do with it. So here is some more detail of how our approach works. So what we do is, given an image, we have our specialized networks, each trained on its own data set, each doing a specific kind of things, like classifying scenes, actions, maybe attributes, and so on. We get the predictions of each of the networks, and then for each type of prediction or cue and each candidate answer, we have to figure out the fit. How does the output of this network, how well does it fit each candidate answer? And for this, we use canonical correlation analysis, or CCA. So it's a textbook technique. From statistics literature, I don't know, maybe even back to the 1930s, but it's really surprising how well it works. We've been able, up till very recently, to beat state-of-the-art approaches with CCA. Now we finally were able to train neural networks to compare images and text, or any kind of paired data from different modalities. You can replace these CCAs with basically trained cross-modal matching networks. We haven't done it. So we get a score from each cue for each candidate answer. We have some scheme for learning weights. We take a weighted combination of these scores, score each candidate answer, pick the best match. So we don't train this end-to-end. We train it in sort of modular way, but you can imagine replacing all of this stuff with neural network modules that can be trained end-to-end, provided there's sufficient data, which MATLAB's dataset is only about 10K images, so it's unclear. So this is what our system looks like. And let me tell you in more detail about some of the cues, because I think some of these cues and some of the data sets that we use can be also very useful for VQA, general purpose VQA, if you figure out how to work them in the right way. OK, so as far as person-centric questions, meaning questions for which you're given ground truth bounding boxes, there are two types that are important having to do with actions and person-object interactions. So of course, the queue that's the most helpful for that would be a network to recognize actions or person-object interactions. Fortunately, we have excellent data sets for this. There's this HICO data set. HICO stands for Humans Interacting with Common Objects. That was collected at Michigan by Jia Deng's group. It has 600 classes. And actually, the objects in this data set are MS COCO objects, but the data set itself does not overlap with MS COCO. So it could be particularly useful for the VQA data set because the vocabulary is exactly matched. And there's also the MPII data set that has just person actions, about 400 of them. So we have a pretty big vocabulary among these two data sets. There are some differences between them, but they're not super important. OK, so what do we do if we want to recognize, let's say, person-object interactions? So if we look at the person bounding box and just ignore everything else, you know, the person bounding box doesn't always contain sufficient information. In some cases, the object is close to the person or the pose is very characteristic. And if you just look within the person bounding box, you can figure out exactly what's going on. In other cases, like flying a kite, the object could be pretty much anywhere else in the image and the pose is not so characteristic. So obviously, you need some sort of context. And the most natural thing to do might be, you might think, let's try just to detect the objects. But to detect objects, even MS COCO objects, which is still a fairly limited vocabulary, is still kind of hard. I haven't checked the latest method, but latest methods for detection, but you know, a lot of these objects are small. You have a lot of false positives. It's very troublesome to detect objects accurately. So what we did, we decided, well, let's just skip the object part. Let's just do a global context. So if we want to detect a person-object interaction or even an action, so it makes the method quite general, let's just combine features from a person region of interest and a whole image region of interest. So with my student Arun Maria a couple of years ago, we built a very simple network that we call a fusion network. It's based on top of fast RCNN. It just concatenates ROI pooling features from the person box and the whole image to predict person-object interactions. There are a couple of sort of tricks or fine points that we have to use. We have to use multiple instance learning because actually the HICO data set does not give you person bounding boxes, and there could be multiple people in the image doing different things. So we need to use ML. And we need to use person bounding boxes detected up front, but person detection works very well, so we can just assume it's solved. And we also have to use a weighted loss for training because for most actions, in fact, all of them, there's way more negative examples than positive examples. But if you do your training the right way, it's a pretty good network. So here are some qualitative examples of what it does. For each box, it gives separate predictions of what it thinks the person is doing. So in the top left image, the person in the green box, the top predictions are hold knife and wield knife. The person in the blue box doesn't get any predictions because no individual action classifier gets more than 0.5 confidence. So qualitatively, it's good behavior. In terms of quantitative evaluation baselines, we confirmed that our tricks, MIL and weighted loss, help to get better performance. So it's a pretty good network, and as I said, it's very simple. So it gives us the predictions that we need to handle action and person-object relationship or interaction questions. And for those, we, as I mentioned, just ignore the object and it works out fine. Interesting person-centric questions. There are questions about person attributes. Unfortunately, there was, when we were looking at this, no ready-made person attribute data set with a large vocabulary. We did a literature search as of maybe a year or two ago. All existing person attribute data sets had maybe a dozen or so attributes. So here, what we did is we ended up actually using a data set that we ourselves collected that can be very and attributes and maybe other things as well. It's the Flickr 30K entities data set. So it just provides grounding for all noun phrases in sentences in an image. So you get bounding boxes associated with noun phrases. So we scraped that data set for all noun phrases having to do with people and found the people phrases that are the most frequent and sort of cleaned up the vocabulary manually and ended up with about 300 person attributes. So from an image like this, the training data that you obtain would be for, for example, old man, bearded man, man in a blue shirt, and so on. So for all attributes that are frequent enough in our data, we get training data and we can train attribute classifiers. And by the way, for the attribute classifiers, we don't use global image context because attributes are very specific to a person and they get confused if you include global context. So we can predict attributes like skier, little girl, man in white shirt, man in white hat, and so on. So if you're looking for large vocabularies of person attributes, as far as I know, our data set is the largest one out there and can be very useful. Okay, so apart from that, there are some open-ended questions that don't give you ground truth regions. The most intriguing of those are image past and image future. So for that, as I mentioned, candidate answers refer to different subjects, and we don't know where the subjects are in the image. So we have to sort of attempt grounding. For each candidate subject in a candidate answer, we have to find the best fitting person box, and we built a CCA model for that. So on top, if the candidate answer is the man enjoyed his meal, we find the man box as the best fitting box. If it's she was doing some work, then we find the woman's and use that as spatial support to extract features. So you could think of it as a type of attention, but it's not an end-to-end trained attention. It's sort of very task-specific, but it works well. Okay, so when we combine the predictions of all these Q-specific networks together, so we have a scene network we talked about. We also have a color predict combination, we get improvements on all questions considerable having to do with attributes, for example. Really the interesting lessons from this. What's good, what can be the takeaway point? It necessarily needs to go out and work on the Mad Libs data set. The open-ended VQA data set for sure is more interesting. But what's useful? Well, what's useful is that there are very good data sets these days with large vocabularies of knowledge of classes that are useful for general VQA. It's a good idea to train networks on those data sets and somehow incorporate them. What's nice about high-level Qs, we can look at the predictions. What are the predictions for person attributes, for person actions, for scene type, and so on. And human interpretable, so we can understand why our system picked a given answer and not some other answer. Of course, what's bad is that Mad Libs dataset, as I said, it's got a lot take these training wheels off. It's got tell you which knowledge to combine. One of the most challenging things is to sort of understand what is it asking me, where do I need to look, which knowledge do I need to bring in. I don't know yet how to do that. It's also good to have end-to-end methods. So that how to have a single end-to-end. You don't want to have just a pile of separate networks sort of cobbled together in a clumsy way. You need to have one giant network somehow trained on multiple data sets and multiple tasks hooked up to a high-level task like VQA. So recent work, I've seen things on arXiv with and one model to rule them all. I don't know if you guys have seen those. I think it's becoming a topic of interest, how to train gigantic, scary networks on multiple data sets to do multiple tasks in parallel on the same image. I think this is where recognition in general should be going. If you look at an image, you want to understand everything simultaneously, maybe predict scene classes, do some kind of depth map estimation, surface normal estimation if you want. Maybe if you find people, predict actions, predict materials, attributes, and so on. But the work I've seen in this direction just really scares me. And, so I myself don't sort of feel up to tackling this challenge to the fullest, but I think this is where we need to go. And in the meantime, hopefully, the knowledge that I shared and, some of the pieces that I talked to you about can be useful.
We have time for some questions.
Yes?
So I have a question about the attributes that you have collected, sort of scraped automatically. So is that available? And is it like
the attributes?
Yeah.
Available on my student's website. My student, no, I don't think is here.
And that is like
so go to my webpage. There's a link to his webpage. There's a little link to the models. So we haven't done emphasizing it, but yes, it's available.
So that is like also manually verified, or is that?
Yeah, yeah. So basically, he just found the most, grouped the most commonly used person phrases and, manually and so on. So it's manually curated.
And how many was that again?
About 300.
Okay, thank you.
But you can also feel free to take the raw Flickr 30, do kind of your own mining.
Okay.
What threshold, I think we use threshold of 50 training examples or 30 training examples. If you're willing to lower your threshold, you can get more, you can do something else with it. And of course, it goes beyond people. So I encourage you to take a look.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you for the nice talk. And I think I completely can't expect to learn everything from the VQA training set and for 2 years. But I know you said the ugly sense for, I mean, even if we ignore all the ugliness of one giant network, or even if we have separate attributes and activities and scenes and objects and surface normals, and we have data sets for all of that, we have networks for all of that. So if you just take the predictions, concatenate that, add a few fully connected layers on top and try and predict answers, do you have a sense for how well that might or might not work?
I think it might work if somebody is willing to do the dirty work. I think it would have like an IBM Watson type flavor. So basically, it would be kind of a very ugly engineering effort. If somebody did it, it probably would work, but this is not what I would like to see happen. And I certainly don't want to touch it myself. So I think in the short term, we just have to do our best. And just kind of see where it goes. But I think we all agree that, it's not realistic, even if the VQA data set was an order of magnitude larger, it's not realistic to expect that it would have full coverage for everything you could want.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? So again, completely agree. You mentioned that, we can cobble it together. And so there's a perspective following on NLP research which suggests that every time you add these intermediate structures and representations and use them to solve some downstream task, it actually just hurts performance, that you're better off just not trying to add these intermediate stages. Do you think that's true for VQA, that it's not, that while using data sets is good as intermediate losses, but forcing intermediate structures may actually hurt downstream performance?
It's very possible, but basically I have no idea at this point how much training data we would need to do everything end-to-end without hand engineering a lot of knowledge. You can probably force it like they forced machine translation, but at this point, I kind of don't have, a very strong sense of the difficulty of this task and how much data it would take. So, but I'm not very dogmatic either way.
Let's thank the speaker again. So our second speaker is Marcus Rohrbach. Marcus is a research scientist at Facebook AI Research. Before joining Facebook, he was a postdoc at University of California, Berkeley with Trevor Darrell. In past few years, he has worked on various language and vision tasks, including VQA, image and video captioning, and more recently on explanation models. He was involved in one of the first few works in VQA and was the lead advisor in last year's challenge winner entry. Today, he is going to talk to us about answering visual questions with end-to-end module networks and explaining decisions. We are looking forward to hear from you, Marcus.
No, this doesn't work. No, it doesn't have.
So we didn't get the first half.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, but okay. I tested before. So you switched it off. Or? Oh. Okay. Okay. So while they set up, I can maybe start talking. You won't see the slides, but I can sort of say thank you to the previous talk, because that's sort of basically the start where we wanted to start off and build a model which can handle multiple tasks, but not build like a huge model which does all things jointly, but rather have like very small neural networks which are composed to build build a network for visual question answering. And we had like an initial model last year, but now what I'm going to talk about today is, in the first part of the talk, is how we can train this really end-to-end and not just use a parser to predict the layout, but predict the layout using a recurrent network. And we called this end-to-end neural module networks. But now I'll wait until we get some slides. No, it doesn't exist, I think. I need like this USB-C to. No. No, this is the old one, right? Okay. So, is your presentation in PowerPoint? Yeah. So we can try it. Yeah. Why did you switch? It worked. Very sorry. It worked before. It worked before. Yeah, it worked before, but you just changed the settings for the recording, so. Okay. Now you'll need the other connector. I'll just get you. Sorry. Just need your slide. I didn't know that existed. Okay. Okay, I have to get this connected. But normally this works, so. Okay, cool. Okay, good. Yeah, so as I said, we want to solve different tasks with different networks which we looked at previously. Most of the work here has been done at Berkeley AI Research, and now I just switched the first letter to Facebook AI Research. So more general, what I want to do is like understand communication about the visual world as humans can do it. And humans can ask questions and answer them, for example. But we want to bring that also to like an automated system, for example, your phone, which could answer you, can I park here, and answers no. And this can be actually quite, such a question can be very complicated. So you might need actually something like a program to answer this question. And first detect if there's a red curb, see if there's space to park there, and then actually you may be able to answer if you can or cannot park here. So that's what we want to do. We want to basically predict a discrete execution graph of neural networks to answer diverse diverse natural language questions. But then this is not very helpful to understand for most humans, because typically you don't want to understand the code. So most humans don't want to understand code. So we want to also explain our decisions with natural language and say, for example, because there's a red curb, which indicates no parking, instead of just showing a program. So we want to explain answers for understandability and trust. And I'm mainly going to talk about these two works. I'll start with learning to reason, end-to-end module networks for visual question answering, which will appear at ICCV. So the problem is, for example, such as this one on the Clever datasets, which have very complicated questions. So that's why it's an interesting test bed for our algorithms. For example, here, how many other things are on the same size as how many other things are of the same size as the green mud ball? And how do we want to do it? We want to predict a neural network which consists of different components, and then execute this neural network to answer this question. And all of these components are basically small neural networks which we put together, then execute jointly. So let's look into more detail what this question means. So first, we have, for example, a find module which gets as input the green mud or the green mud ball. So it predicts automatically where to attend to in the text. And then it localizes exactly this region. And given this attention, here now you see the attention, sorry. Given this attention, we then do the next step and look for things which are of the same size. And again, we basically attend to all the regions which are of the same size, and then we can finally count them to answer how many other things are there. And here in this case, we get it correctly. It's 4 other objects. So let me give a few more details, but I would like to say that we cannot just only do that for like linear execution graphs, but it can be also trees, like you can see here, and it can also be executed on real images. While for the most of the talk, I'll stick with these Clever dataset examples. So here's basically the sort of the overview of the entire network. And basically we take in the question, we encode it with an RNN, and then we predict the the execution graph at each time state of a decode RNN. And each of the modules, which you can see here on the right, attends to parts of the text. And then we build this network, which gets attended text features input and either attentions or different image features. We execute it, and then we predict the answer. To be able to learn that, because there's discrete steps we have to do, we use reinforcement learning to optimize it, where only the answer is used to reward reinforcement learning. And yeah, so there's like sort of a large variety of modules which we have, and they can be defined in whatever way you need them for your problem. But for the clever data set, and specifically, we came up with those kind of modules. And you see they have either attentions, so A as input, and or image features, and they typically output either an attention mask or then a softmax answer, because in the clever data set, you just need a softmax. You could also add an RNN as output if you want to really predict text as output. Maybe one more detail I'm missing is that, yeah, we just train it with question, answer, and image pairs. And we start with an expert. We start with an expert policy, and then fine-tune with the reinforcement learning our policy. And in the clever data set, the expert policy is just given by the data set, because all the questions are constructed automatically, at least in the first version of the data set which we use. Let me show you some examples. So first we started on the shapes data set. Here we can see, do you have a question? Oh, okay. We started on the shapes data set. We compare with the neural module networks. We have ours with cloning from the expert, solve basically the data set, and when we just don't use any expert policies, so just learn the policy search from scratch, we get close to perfect performance. And here you see two examples about the two different setups, behavior cloning from the expert policy and policy learning from scratch. And we see typically the policy learning from scratch finds sort of simpler execution graphs. And in this case, both answered correctly. We also evaluated on the larger clever data set. And at the time of when we submitted that, we significantly outperformed all prior work in that. And again, we compare, here we compare only cloning the expert directly and using additional policy search to refine the module layout. Maybe it's more interesting to look at a qualitative example. It's maybe a bit small to see it, but here we correctly predict this tree, because at test time we don't have any ground truths for the questions, at least we assume we don't have it. So for example here, this find module directly predicts that it has to look at right, and the other find module looks at blue cylinder. So the attention is mainly at blue cylinder, and then sort of it relocates it and filters it, and then it compares these two outputs to answer the questions. Does the blue cylinder have the same material as the big block on the right side of the red metallic thing? The last result I'd like to show is like that it also works on the VQA dataset with real images, but that's much more challenging to make this network outperform prior work. So we just get like state-of-the-art performance. And so this is sort of the first part of my talk, and I'm happy to take already question at that point because the next part will be about slightly different work. So if anyone has questions. Okay, then I'll continue. So what I said now is basically we can answer questions. Now in the second part of the talk, I'll discuss how we want to explain them with natural language and also with grounding. And I'll say a bit more to that in a second. So this is the work Attentive Explanations, Justifying Decisions and Pointing to the Evidence. So we have the scenario, what is the person doing? The answer, skiing. But then if you might want to ask, why is this actually the case? Or how do you know that this person is skiing and not hiking, for example, through the snow? And what we want to do, we want to predict, on the one hand, a textual explanation, for example, because the person has skis and poles and there's snow, and also a localization of this. So like similar to humans, which can explain you things and point you to why this is the right answer. So in this case, the skis and the poles might be the most discriminating factor for the answer skiing. We want to do the same thing, allowing machines to do that. As I said, not in this work, we don't actually use those modules, but we're using more end-to-end approach, and it's on the real VQA data set. So prior work from ourselves did already generate explanations on the CAP birds data set, but there's actually no explanation ground truth. And we found, while in this work we could actually start off with the descriptions and learn explanation models, this is much more difficult on the VQA data because it's much more diverse. So what we did, we started with the Microsoft COCO VQA data set, and additionally collected both textual explanations for 20,000 images. We collect about 30,000 textual explanations, and for the small test set, we also collected ground truth pointing or attention maps based on what humans think is the most relevant part of the image to explain the answer. We not only did that for VQA, but also for, so this is the MPI human post data set. I think Svetlana also talked about this data set. And here we also collect additional explanations and ground truth attention maps. And we show a bit how this data looks like. For example, while descriptions say, for example, a man on a snowboard is on a ramp, the explanation, textual explanation for what is the person doing snowboard is they are on a snowboard in a snowboarding outfit. Or instead of a gang of biker police riding their bikes, information down the street, the answer to the question, can these people arrest someone? Yes, and the explanation is because they are Vancouver police. And we also have corresponding ground truths for the pointing task. So like pointing where it's like skiing, where skateboarding, where's baseball, where is it like grounded in the image. And as I said before, we did similar things for activities. Here you see some textual explanations, and here you see some grounding explanations. Yes?
Is the grounding explanations asking somebody to segment the objects that are related to the question?
And the answer. So the Turkers get the question and the answer which you see, they don't get the explanation. And then they have to sort of say, where do they think is this explained in the image? And it doesn't need to be like this, what sort of they think? So it's not always as precise. So like we collected 3 per question answer pair. Sometimes they're less precise. This, I'm not yeah, I think I didn't put like different variants in. My slide crashed and I forgot that slide to put it in again. Yeah. So we start off with our last year's model from the VQA challenge, but we slightly modify it and replace the MCB pooling with element-wise multiplication, and importantly, use the convolution over the input of the question because it's not of the image, and sine squared NL2 normalization. And with this, we get actually performance that is slightly better for a single model than MCB, or last year's model. And there's actually contemporary work from Kim et al., and they use a tanh instead of sine square and L2 norm, and they also get slight improvements over the MCB model, while keeping everything else fixed. So interestingly, already the VQA model gives you like a good idea where to point to because it's has this attention mechanism. So we have this first answer attention, and then I now slightly switched the visualization, but basically this is the VQA part. And then we add a second attention mechanism to predict the answer. So basically, we take the input, the predicted answer as input, and the visual features, predict again an attention, and then predict the output description. And now we can see sort of how good are both the textual explanations and the groundings of these attention masks. And first, we evaluated the textual justifications, and both with automatic measures, we see that our model improves over several base lengths, including the one of Hendricks et al. For our previous explanation model, training our model on descriptions only, using a captioning model, or ours without explicit explanation attention. So just not using the second attention, just using the first one. And similar is true if we do a human evaluation, also our model performs the best. And this was on the activities. For the VQA, the performance difference of the benefit of the second attention is not so big, but if we fine-tune the VQA model, it gets slightly better. We also evaluated the pointing, and we used on the one hand the Earth-Musev distance, which takes spatial proximity into account. So if things are close by and the model predicts things close to the correct pointing, then it gets still some of the score. And we see that our fine-tuned model for VQA gets best performance, and we also evaluate on the VQA head data set from Das et al., and we also see that our fine-tuned model significantly outperforms the previous ways to look at attention. And I think the second point, which I think is interesting, is that the explanation attention, so the second attention, which we introduce by actually explaining the model with natural language, gets consistently better performance than the answer attention. So you can see that both on this evaluation with rank correlation and also in this evaluation, it's typically slightly or quite a bit better to use the second attention map. Some qualitative results. I think it's always interesting to look at sort of where only part of the thing changes. For example, here we have the same image and different questions. So is it sunny? Yes. And what is the person doing surfing? You see we get different predictions of the both in with respect to textual explanation and the pointing explanation. Or the other way around, if you have the same question and answer but a different image, we get also different justifications and different pointings. have some more examples, but maybe at this point let me conclude the talk. So we learn to predict neural module networks with an end-to-end model learned from images, question, and question-answer triples. And we use imitation learning and then reinforcement learning. And we have results on both clever and real VQA. And for justifying decisions and pointing to the evidence, we collected a data set. And our model can explain decisions by pointing and by giving a textual justification. And interestingly, when you learn the pointing with textual explanations, that improves in better pointing performance than the normal attention model. With this, it's not your time to ask questions, and you might ask, what's next? I'll tell you that we have like a movie VQA challenge, and that will be at ICC3. And yeah, thank you to all my collaborators, like specifically Rong, Hang, and Sess, who did like the majority of the work, and this was a joint work with Kate, who will give like the next talk.
Maybe we can have only one question.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I do have one question. So when you try to illustrate the reasoning, or I mean the explanation or point, it's more like an empirical attention heat map, or do you have some more like model level explanation why this is picked? Or I'm thinking of like recently, for example, people talk about neural symbolic reasoning or this.
You mean like in the first model? Yeah. You mean like in this explanation part, or in
the explanation part?
Okay. You mean like how, if this is correct? I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah. So if even your model can infer the attention map like this, it's more like you compute the attention and then highlight it.
Yes.
So is there a deeper understanding for why this? I mean, at the symbolic level, why this is the explanation of this answer?
We don't know why it's the explanation. The only thing we can do at that point is to evaluate it if it matches what humans think. That's a good pointing explanation.
I see. So this one is what humans think.
So this is what humans think, and basically in this evaluation here, basically we compare how close is what humans think to what our machine thinks.
I see. Okay, great. Thanks.
Let's have the speaker again. So our next speaker is Kate Senko, and Kate is assistant professor at Boston University and leading the computer vision and learning group. She has done a lot of interesting work in vision language and also in domain adaptation, and including the describing videos, some of the early models from the attention-based VQA and image captioning and recent modular-based VQA. So Kate is going to give a talk about why do you say that, explaining and diversifying image captioning models. So we are looking to hear from you, Kate.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? Okay, hi everybody. Thank you to the organizers for organizing the workshop and for inviting me. And I'm going to continue on some of the themes that were brought up already this morning. In particular, I'm also going to talk about explaining vision and language models, which is something that Marcus just talked about. But I'm going to tell you about a different model for doing that. And I'm also going to talk about how can we diversify these models so that they don't only learn about objects that are present in their training data sets. And so that is something that Lana alluded to this morning as well. How can we transfer knowledge from auxiliary data sets? First I'm going to start with explaining. And so this is work that was actually presented at this conference, and it's joint work with my students, Vasily and Abir, my postdoc Abir, and Jianming Zhang at Adobe Research. So I'm going to talk about captioning models, but I hope that there are many lessons here that are applicable to open-ended visual question answering. So in captioning, our goal is to take an input image or video in this case. I'm going to talk about mostly video captioning, but also some image. And then use that video as input to a neural network that then predicts a caption. It's a variable length sequence of words that describes the main activity or the main content of the image. But what I'm interested in particular is why is the network predicting the caption, right? So the question that I'm going to talk about today is why did the network say that? And one of the reasons that I became interested in this is that if we take this captioning model, for example, and you might want to guess maybe the network said, this a woman is cutting a piece of meat because it detected the person, it detected a woman. But then we run this experiment where we train two versions of the network. One we train on cooking videos, and another we train on science videos. These are tags from YouTube, okay? And so then now if we feed this exact same video into the first network that was trained on cooking, it predicts a sentence that starts with "a woman is," and when we feed it into the science trained network, it starts the sentence with "a man is talking about." So clearly the network is learning some biases in this data, but also shows us that the reason that a network might predict certain words really has more to do with the language model than what it actually detected visually in the input. So in this work, we wanted to understand what did the network actually see and what did it say based on what it saw in the input video or image versus something else that it inferred from language and not from vision. Okay? So we want to know, in particular, we want to explain the predicted caption words by seeing if the network can actually localize objects that correspond to words in those captions. Okay, so so in this work, apologize, video is not playing for some reason. Okay, I'll go to my backup. So in this work, we presented an explainable neural network for captioning images and video. Oh, thank you. Something went wrong here. Just give me a second. Sorry? No. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't want to. It doesn't show the video. Okay, I'll just do it without the video then. Sorry about that. So basically, in the video that is not playing, you would see a model that can explain the caption words using what we call top-down visual saliency. So basically, what we want to know is some sort of attention map or saliency map on the input that is related to each of the words or phrases predicted by our captioning network. And this is very related to what's known as attention or attention layers or soft attention models, which adds special layers to a network that sequentially process regions in the input image and basically learns which regions to look at using this attention layer. So this was proposed by Xu et al. At ICML 15 as a model called Show, Attend, and Tell, and has been used fairly extensively to sort of add an attention layer to various networks. So some of the issues that we had with this as an explanation model for visual captioning is that first of all, this only provides us with spatial attention maps, and what we really want is spatiotemporal. And if we add layers for spatiotemporal, we were adding a lot of parameters to the network. And the other, so our motivation is how can we actually analyze the network as is without modifying it, without adding extra layers or parameters, just get out what is its implicit attention. So the key idea was to essentially probe the network with small parts of the input. So our network in this case is an encoder-decoder network, which is fairly standard at this point for captioning and video captioning. And so what we want to do is we want to take the sequence of input. Here I'm showing frames of the video. And we want to just take one frame and probe the network with that frame and see what is the probability of the output word in the sentence. So this will lead us to a way to compute spatial and spatiotemporal saliency map. And the nice thing is that we don't need any special attention layers, and we will get spatiotemporal attention for free, essentially. Okay, so just very quickly how this works. So the base model we're using is this encoder-decoder network, which takes video frames, applies a CNN to compute convolutional features, which you see here, 8 by 8 by 248 grid of convolutional features. And so this is for one frame I'm showing you this for one frame of the video. And then these features are average pooled to produce a single 248-dimensional vector. Now, this vector represents all the semantic content of that frame. So these frames are encoded by an LSTM encoder, and then that state is fed into an LSTM decoder, which predicts the words. So what we want to do now is we want to take, as I said before, a small piece of this input. And so we start with essentially taking one convolutional neuron output, so just one vector corresponding to one location in that grid, and feed that into our encoder-decoder network, and then look at the log probability of the corresponding output words in the sentence. And so we continue this for all of the locations in one frame. We get this grid of values. Now, this is still not what we want because it's not normalized. So for example, for some words that are not informative, like a or is, the attention is essentially high at this point for all of the locations. So what we do next is we do this for all the frames in the input video, which is what you see at the top right. And then we normalize it, obtaining the heat maps that you see on the bottom right, and then interpolate so that we can show smoother heat maps. So that's the final result. And so if we go back to this video that I showed you in the beginning, where the model predicted a woman is cutting a piece of meat, now we can see, we can actually visualize using this approach, what is the frame that had the highest saliency for each of the words in the caption. And so these are the frames that I'm showing you here. And then also in each of those frames, we can see the spatial attention that was predicted by our model, which shows the visual evidence. And here we actually see that, for example, which of the visual features led to the word cutting and the word piece and the word meat. And also for the woman, we see that it's actually not a very consistent attention map for the woman, which kind of correlates with what I said earlier, that the model just may know that if it sees a cooking scene, a likely way to start the sentence to say a woman is cooking. Here's another example. This is a video that was captioned with a man is talking about a phone. And I'm showing the most salient frames at the bottom for man talking on the phone. And again, here we see a fairly consistent map for the man and the phone. Not so much for talking, which kind of makes sense because a a lot of these videos, you don't actually see, you know, visual evidence of people talking. You might hear them talking, right? But the network here is inferring that talking is an appropriate word to insert. If it wants to say a man, you know, on the phone, something is happening, a man is describing a phone, we're talking about a phone. So that could be coming from the language model. Here's another example. A woman is skating on the snow. So we can actually use this to understand why a model made mistakes. Right, so here it said skating instead of skiing, which was the correct caption in this case. And if we look at the saliency map for the word skating, we see that actually is mostly located on the white parts of the frame, the snow essentially. So it's seeing snow, or maybe it just thinks it's ice and it's just something white, and it's correlating that with the word skating. And it's similar for snow. Okay, so we evaluated this model. Unfortunately, we didn't have a data set that had spatiotemporal ground truth for salient regions in videos, so we instead applied it to image data set. And so we can do the same thing for images. We can caption images with this model if we slide a window across the image, and that gives us our sequence of frames, essentially. So we applied this model to image captioning, and here's one result. So the input now is a single image, and the caption is a man in a jacket is standing at the slot machine. Here you see the saliency for man, for jacket, standing, slot, and machine. And you know, for the most part, it makes sense. The model is sort of pointing to relevant parts of the image, except for standing, perhaps. That doesn't seem to be getting any visual evidence for that. So to evaluate this in a quantitative way, we applied, we used the Flickr 30K entities data set, which Lana talked about this morning. So this is a large data set that's annotated very extensively with both captions that you see on the bottom. So there are multiple different captions for each image. And the nice thing about it is that for each phrase, like noun phrases like pierced ears or glasses or an orange hat, each of those phrases has a corresponding bounding box annotated in the image. So we use this data set to play a pointing game and evaluate our model in terms of both pointing accuracy. So here pointing is defined as, you know, if we take the highest, the most salient point in the image, did that land inside the bounding box for that phrase or that word, right? So for example, here, an elderly man is, the saliency for an elderly man is in the far left image. And, you know, that is actually pointing inside the bounding box annotated for that phrase, an elderly man. So, and we also evaluate, based on the heat map, the attention overlap. So we look at how much this saliency map overlaps with the bounding box. So, so to evaluate the correctness of our attention map, we compare it to several baseline methods like just random attention map, or essentially attention on everything. And we also compared it to soft attention. So soft attention in this case gets about 38.38 score of this attention correctness metric. And we see that with our model, we can improve that to 47%. So, so our model is actually doing better than this approach of adding an explicit attention layer to the model. And then having that layer learn sort of to associate which of the locations go with which words. So we also evaluated captioning performance, see that this model does as well as others on captioning, so it's not affecting the quality of captions. So 5 minutes. Okay, so since I'm running out of time, I'm just going to skip to this next part of my talk and talk about very briefly. So I talked about explaining, and I also want to mention diversifying, which I think is very important for language and vision models. So the problem with language and visual models is this issue of lack of training data. Right, so in object recognition, for example, we have 14 million images in ImageNet, 22,000 classes, so we have this plenty of annotated data for object recognition. But if you compare that to something like visual description or captioning, the annotations of images with captions only contain about 80 classes of objects, right? So it's a pretty limited set of objects, just because it's difficult to collect these data sets. So what we want to do in this work is propose a captioning model that can take learn both from paired image and caption data. So for example, MS COCO captioning data set. And so in this kind of data, we'll have words like a horse, for example, but this input image is not a horse, right? This is actually some other object, which doesn't exist in our captioning data set. So what we want to do is we want to take the ImageNet data set, which has images labeled with this object category. This is a no copy. And we want to combine it somehow so that the model can learn to transfer this knowledge and insert it into a sentence, right? So we don't want just an image captioning model that will just say "okapi," right? We want it to output a sentence describing the whole scene and insert that novel word "okapi" in context in the sentence. So we wanted to say something like an okapi standing in the middle of a field. So, so we proposed this model, and this was presented earlier in the conference. The main insights here are to recognize and describe objects using outside data, so not just image caption data sets. So we want to train effectively on external sources of data. And second insight we used is that we want to somehow transfer similar objects between our data sets. For example, we want to somehow inject knowledge in the network that okapi is similar to something like zebra. And we did that by using semantic embeddings, semantic word embeddings. In this case, we used glove embedding. So with glove embedding, we automatically get this mapping from, for example, zebra, which occurs in MS COCO, and okapi, which is close in that semantic embedding to zebra. And so then we combine these two parts into a captioning model. But you might say, well, this isn't really different from existing models. But the problem with this is that it leads to catastrophic forgetting. So if we fine-tune or train this model on captioning data, we'll forget all the objects it learned about in ImageNet. So the final insight here is to overcome this forgetting by training jointly. So we propose a joint loss that we use to train simultaneously on all of these data sets. Okay, so that's the main high-level idea. I'll just show you quickly some examples here. There's an evaluation in the paper if you're interested. But here are some examples qualitatively. So these are objects that are ImageNet objects. They don't appear in MS COCO captioning data, but our model can still caption them in context. So for example, it can say, a small brown and white jackal is standing in a field. So it's transferred the word jackal from ImageNet and inserted it into this caption, so it's properly captioning that specific object. There's some more examples. So this one on the right, a woman is posing for a picture with a chiffon dress. So chiffon is, again, not something that exists in the paired COCO captioning data set, but the model learned it from ImageNet and inserted it into the sentence. Okay, so I'll end here since I think I'm pretty much out of time. I want to thank again my co-authors, my students at Boston University, and also Subhashini, who was the lead author on the novel object captioning work, and also Lisa Ann Hendricks, Marcus Rohrbach, Raymond Mooney, and Trevor Darrell. And thank you.
We have time for one question. Questions?
Thanks. I think it's quick. I noticed sometimes it says something like a corkscrew and a corkscrew, or a copy and a copy. Is that because it's substituting for two different words that were there originally with the same word? I mean, was
yeah,
it,
so
or
one
the
of
cougar
the-
with the cougar in its mouth, was it?
Very, very perceptive. Yeah, so I actually had this slide that I didn't do, but yeah, so one of the common errors of this model is repetition. So we'll say balaclava, black and white photo of a man in a balaclava. And we're not quite sure, or yeah, cougar with a cougar in its mouth. So we're not quite sure why it's doing that. One guess is that you know, the model has some strong evidence for that particular word, and it's just, you know, it's a high probability word. And it's maybe that the language model hasn't fully learned, you know, how to not insert it more than once. So, good question.
Thank you, Kate. We'll now be taking a 15-minute break, and we'll be resuming at 10:45. Thank you.